The Goss Government took office at the very end of 1989, and we came into office after 32 years of Conservative rule, and there was an enormous need for an enormous tranche of law reform. There was just such a big backlog to do. Things that we would now regard as shocking were routine back in those days.
Women having to leave the public service as soon as they got married, or the expectation that as soon as you were pregnant, that's it. You aren't to work anymore. And we think that that's so long ago, but it wasn't.
It was routine for people to knock somebody back for a job by virtue of the fact that they were white or black, by virtue of the fact that they were Catholic or Protestant, by virtue of the fact that they were young or old. My children had just been born, and I went to this restaurant. My son was hungry, and so he had a meal. But when I got to work the next day, in another restaurant somewhere else, a woman had been thrown out of the restaurant for breastfeeding. And so I was walking up and down my office, ranting about how absurd it was that everybody in that restaurant could get a feed except the person who needed it most. And I said, if I could do something about this, I would. And one of my staffers said, well, as a matter of fact, Mr. Attorney, you've got a meeting about the drafting of the Anti-Discrimination Act very shortly. Why don't you raise it then? That's what happened.
Queensland is the only mainland state which doesn't have anti-discrimination laws. Attorney-General Dean Wells got the green light from Cabinet to prepare legislation outlawing discrimination.
I said, I want this to be a state-of-the-art act. I want to draw from best practice in all of the other states of Australia. And we did that, and it was at the time the state-of-the-art act, and many of the aspects of our Anti-Discrimination Act were followed by the other states.
Cultural change, changes in society do require personal responsibility and individuals changing the way they behave and interact with people. But that often requires governments to make decisions, to put in place policies and legislation to drive that change. And that's what the Anti-Discrimination Act was all about.
It means a fair go. You can't discriminate against people, you've got to give them a fair go. That's what the legislation is for.
The anti-discrimination legislation in Queensland has been really important. And I think one of the most important things that we've seen is the ability of law to change culture in Queensland. So these ideals of equality and non-discrimination are actually characteristics of our culture in Queensland. And I think that is really largely due to our anti-discrimination laws.
That doesn't mean that behaviour doesn't occur today, but what it does mean is that people can more readily identify that is inappropriate and that action can be taken to stop that behaviour. And that's extremely important to ensure that we respect each other in our community.
So I think that Queenslanders have a really good sense of what equality is, of what discrimination is, that it isn't acceptable, and that if they experience discrimination, there is a way to seek a remedy. I also think that one of the really exciting things about anti-discrimination legislation is that we have an anti-discrimination commission, and so that means that regardless of whether you have the money or the resources to pay a lawyer, you actually have access to a forum where your complaint can be aired and a remedy can be achieved without actually needing to even go to court.
Now, we talk about the legislation and we're celebrating 25 years of the Anti-Discrimination Act, but we should celebrate the Commission and the important work they do, because the Commission has a really important education role. We can have a piece of legislation, but if it just sits on the shelf and no one's out there actually advocating for change, for compliance in relation to what is accepted and appropriate under the legislation, then you don't get those changes in behaviour.
The Campaign for a Human Rights Act for Queensland started after our last election. So in February 2016, lots of community organisations from throughout Queensland representing all types of interest groups as well as individuals got together and formed an alliance. So my role in the campaign is to help to coordinate that effort along with other representatives of community organisations.
I used to think that it was unnecessary to have a Human Rights Act. I'm older and wiser now. I understand human nature much better. We, in a society like the one that we're in now, I think that such a society ought to look at every opportunity to ensure that human rights are enforced and maintained for those who have them.
There's clear situations in Queensland where people experience human rights violations that aren't properly characterised as discrimination. So it could be the treatment of a person with disability in a group housing situation. It could be an Aboriginal child seeking access to their family in child protection proceedings. It could be the dignity of an old person in aged care facilities. So all of these sorts of things give rise to human rights complaints that aren't properly categorised as discrimination.
I was very pleased earlier this year to initiate a review asking the Parliamentary Committee of Legal Affairs and Community Safety under the Queensland Parliament to consider whether we should have a human rights bill in Queensland and what form that might take if they do recommend that there should be one. There isn't a bipartisan position across Parliament. There doesn't appear to be a bipartisan position across the community, but that doesn't mean it's not an important issue that we shouldn't be looking at, and that's what we're doing currently, working our way through those recommendations of the committee's report. I think that the Anti-Discrimination Act has withstood time. There has not been significant changes. Certainly there's been attributes added over the years, and that's important to reflect changes in communities' views on things. I think we're looking at it in a very different context to what we might have years ago when it was put in there, but it's just as important now than ever.
If a woman of my daughter's generation goes for a job now, be pretty confident that the cards are not going to be secretly stacked against her. We know that there's always residual problems, but now and then, two different ball games completely.